So we've seen Hamas recently state, just yesterday I think, that they're not going to follow through with the ceasefire deal, which would see hostages slowly released in exchange for Palestinian criminals and terrorists, as well as other things and aid that Israel would agree to supply. But we also saw, a few days prior to that, 3 hostages released that looked, frankly, like Holocaust survivors, which President Trump also made the same comment about, looked utterly emaciated, and we learned from their testimony, having been released, at the terror that they experienced in the Hamas dungeons, where they were hung from their legs, they were burned, beaten, and starved, fed rotten pitta, basically, every day. And Hamas have now said they're no longer agreeing to the ceasefire deal. And President Trump has just spoken from the Oval Office, and I want to show you what he says, because what he said is so morally true, right, and the approach that should have been taken, frankly, on October the 8th, 2023. He's issued an ultimatum to Hamas, and he has said that if they don't release all the hostages by 12 p.m, noon on Saturday, then all hell will break loose. Have a watch of his words.
Well, I would say this, and I'm going to let that because that's Israel's decision, but as far as I'm concerned, if all of the hostages aren't returned by Saturday at 12 o'clock, I think it's an appropriate time. I would say cancel it and all bets are off and let hell break out. I'd say they ought to be returned by 12 o'clock on Saturday, and if they're not returned, all of them, not in drips and drabs, not 2 and 1 and 3 and 4 and 2. Saturday at 12 o'clock, and after that, I would say all hell is going to break out. Well,
many people are left wondering, why was this not said on October the 8th, 2023? This whole notion of negotiating with Hamas, negotiating with terrorists, where we release murderers back into the streets, where they can plot similar attacks. And they've said they want to do that, Palestinian terrorists who have been released in these deals. Only for Israel to accept hostages in dribs and drabs, exactly as Trump put it. It's utterly unacceptable. See, Elon Levy, the former spokesperson for Israel, he said Trump just added an extra thing, but they were saying, release the hostages. That's what America was saying. That's what people who are supporting Israel were saying since October the 7th. He said, but Trump's added 2 words, or else. Release the hostages, or else. This is the only approach that is right and just, and probably the most effective, which is to say, you either do what we want, you either surrender and give back our hostages, or you're going to face absolute hell. Not come to the table, come on, let's negotiate. That's not the way you deal with terrorists. And it certainly doesn't seem to me, from what I've learned and understood, that from a Jewish moral perspective, that you don't negotiate with terrorists. The reason should be obvious. That used to be obvious to us. It used to be an obvious approach to say, don't negotiate with terrorists, in the aftermath of September the 11th. Why? Because the second you negotiate with terrorists, you encourage terrorism. You create a terrorism industry. You start trading hostages for terrorists and giving them what they want, then you make every single Israeli and every single Jew a potential hostage target. Far from protecting your people, you're actually endangering them. The only way you deal with evil terrorists like this is through strength and military might and forcing them to their knees to surrender. That's the only way. The Talmud teaches that you can't do exchanges for hostages when the price is too high, when it could potentially lead to more bloodshed. People forget that Sinwar, the architect of October 7th, was released in a prior hostage deal with Gilad Shalit, among many other Arab criminals. Could the message not be any clearer? What else is it going to take for us to wake up? Now, I have no doubt that Israel has had to come to a lot of these agreements because of huge international pressure. But we shouldn't give in to that pressure. We've always been on our own, ultimately. And the world, far from pushing us down, has slowly taken note. And we've moved the world in a more Jewish values direction over the last 3,000 years, despite their kicking and screaming, and despite being on our own. So we shouldn't underestimate our ability to provide moral leadership and to stand up for what we need to when we need to. And so the deal that some people are upset about, Steve Witkoff and others, in the American camp, for enabling these, the hostage deal recently, people, I think, need to appreciate that actually this deal was something that Israel and Hamas agreed to prior to the Trump administration, and Trump was simply just helping to facilitate that. And probably the fact that Hamas came to the table was only because they were nervous of what Trump's going to do. But now Trump has had the good sense to recognize that this is unacceptable morally. And he's absolutely right. This dribs and drabs approach of hostages slowly coming in, looking emaciated, in exchange for these Palestinian criminals being let back onto the streets, where there's absolutely zero moral equivalence. And frankly, he understands that it's playing into Hamas' hands. And he understands that actually we have to go back to the very simple approach of you don't negotiate with terrorists, and peace comes through strength. Hamas has to be brought to their knees. That's what actually I think brought them to even doing this current agreement that's had, because they were nervous about Trump. And now Trump is coming in and saying all hell's going to break loose. Now, what that will mean, I'm not sure. Whether he'll say to Israel, you have the green light to go and completely decimate Hamas and forget this ceasefire agreement. Whether that means the American military will be involved, I'm not sure. But this approach, whatever it means in practice, is another question. But the approach of saying we are simply going to tell them you better do what we want or else is the morally right approach. Now, for those who say, well, Hamas really have Israel where they want them, and it's not going to threaten them saying or else, because if Israel goes super hard militarily in Gaza, it will potentially endanger the hostages' lives. And so there's actually a limited amount of what they can do. To which I would say the following. I know this may well be extremely politically incorrect to say this, but it's the world is, I think, suffering from too many people scared to say hard truths. The first thing is, if you really believe in this principle of we don't negotiate with terrorists, that means that you have to fight to get rid of Hamas in a way that does not allow them to negotiate terms of fighting because they have hostages among them. If you allow them to dictate things and the way you fight based on that, then you are negotiating with terrorists. You are putting your people at risk. If you're going to let them stop you from getting rid of Hamas, getting rid of the security threat long term. For as long as you continue to tell them that you taking hostages is going to affect the way we fight, the more you're incentivizing them and the more you're going to allow them to continue. But more than that, let's remember that it's actually in Hamas's interests. It's in their interests to keep the hostages alive. They're not going to want to put them in harm's way, because if they put them in harm's way, they lose their leverage. But the key point is, we cannot allow them to hold Israel hostage in any way. Absolutely, I pray every single day to get the hostages out, and I hope and pray that the IDF will manage to get them and release them. But the way it has to be done, the morally just and right approach, is through military strength alone and military pressure and bringing Hamas to their knees. You'll notice that other Arab countries, when they fight each other, and when terrorist armies fight other terrorist armies, they don't take hostages. Why is that? The reason is because they know it won't pay. It won't pay to take hostages because the other side will still fight to destroy the enemy, regardless of whether they take hostages. So that has to be the right approach. And Trump is right to say enough's enough. And frankly, many people are wondering, why wasn't this said sooner? Why didn't President Biden on October the 8th say, if Hamas don't release all these hostages by 2 or 3 days' time, then I will fully back up Israel to let all hell break loose. We've seen that they are prepared to bring hostages when they're pushed enough. So why don't we get it over with much faster? Which could mean a lot less bloodshed, by the way, for both sides, including the people of Gaza. Hi, thank you so much for watching. To watch another one, click here. To stay up to date with all our content, click here to subscribe. And if you're able to, you can help support JTV to grow and grow by clicking join below this video, where you can become a member and get perks including early access to videos and private live discussions with me. But most of all, you'll be partnering with us on our mission to change the world.